And welcome once again to Ewtn's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest on this program is John Henry Crosby. He's the editor and presenter of Alice von Hillebrand's Remnant of Paradise, selected essays with remembrances by her friends, published proudly by the Hilderbrand Project, and of course naturally available through the Ewtn religious catalog, ewtnrc.com, for all things Catholic, and especially for all things Alice von Hillebrand. Always great to
be with you, Doug.
Great to be with you. Now you've got, Dietrich von Hildebrand. You've got Alice von Hillebrand. This is Alice's work. Both of them are gone based on their age. You're a young man. How do you get connected with the Hildebrand Project?
Well, both of my parents knew the Hildebrands. My mother is Austrian and grew up knowing Dietrich von Hildebrand and then also Alice as a young girl. And my dad met the Dietrich and Alice von Hildebrand as a student at Georgetown. He invited Dietrich to give a lecture at Georgetown. It was a very controversial lecture on topics related to Vatican II, and but that changed the course of my dad's life. He was going to go study philosophy somewhere else, and Dietrich von Hildebrand said, "No, you need to study with one of my students." So my dad went to Austria. That's where he met my mother, among other things. And so I came up in this family in which Dietrich and Alice von Hildebrand were revered. I think I admired Dietrich first for his anti-Nazi resistance. That appealed to me as a young man. But then I got to meet...
Right, so it's like a movie, his
story.
It's
like a movie. I mean, the story of his escape and his wit and his resistance is extraordinary. But I got to meet Alice, or Lily, as we all knew her, probably in my early teen years. And I remember once being invited over. We were staying at the home of her great friend Madeleine Stebbins, and I had a chance to go over after dinner to have a chat, or a tete-a-tete, as Lily would call it, with her. And I was just so impressed by her. I mean, even as a young teenage boy, I was sort of swept away by her wit and her brilliance and her charm, and she really captivated me. And so that's how I first got to know her. Right.
So where is your group actually located? Where is the project actually located these days?
So the Hildebrand Project is based on the campus of Franciscan University of Steubenville, a very good home for us. We are a grateful affiliate of the university. My dad, who was, again, a student of von Hildebrand's, built up a philosophy department there.
Right, he did a couple of series, or worked on a series.
That's right, that's right.
Even your mom was involved with one as well.
That's right, yes. My mom and dad did the live show with Mother Angelica many moons ago. So yeah, it's a very, very good home for us. It's the base of our operations. We run our summer seminars and other activities there.
Okay, well, let me ask you, how did you decide which particular essays you wanted to put in this particular book?
Well, that was difficult, as you can imagine. Lily was incredibly prolific as an essayist. It was maybe the form that came most naturally to her, and I think part of it was that she was such a person of the spoken word, right? And in the personal encounter with someone in conversation. And these essays have that character. They just flow out of her. She used to email me and she would say, dear one, I've just shaken this out of my sleeve. And in a couple of hours, she would write something, a gem. So I don't know what the total number of essays are, but they're probably more than 100 and maybe a good deal more. And so our goal was to try to find something representative of all the different topics that she spent her life meditating on. So there are essays in there on the issues of Catholic femininity, for example. There are essays in there on education. There's essays in there on the sacramentals. She had a lot of wisdom sometimes about very specific Catholic things. She encourages the recovery of the sacramentals. There's a beautiful essay in there in which she calls for a feast to be made in honor of Our Lady, Queen of Widows. She had such a sensitivity.
Well, she had that wonderful book.
That's right. By grief refined.
Yeah, very powerful.
And she was a widow for for much of her life.
I always recommended that book to anybody.
So we wanted to give people a sense of sort of all the different topics that Lily had devoted her thought and reflection to. Now, the thing that's interesting about this book is when we first envisioned it, it was just supposed to be a collection of essays. But then after she passed away, we collected so many wonderful remembrances of people who knew her. And what became clear is that Lily lived in the hearts of those who loved her.
Absolutely.
In a unique way, and those stories capture that, and so we wanted to contain that. So there's one in there by you.
That's right.
There's one in there by me.
That was a Bookmark episode where she kicked me on the leg. Yes, that's one of my favorite stories.
That's right. That's right.
And Mr. Keck, why are you kicking me?
That's right. Despite the fact that you had told her this is my discreet signal.
This is I'm going to let you know we're going for a break. But and then she told me what Keck, my name, meant, and I told her, well, it's just that. She said, oh no, it's much more than that. So she was funny. You talk about the idea of everything she'd done, that it was driven by her yearn for contact with people.
Yeah.
What did you mean?
Well, I mean, so the comment you're citing there was that she, when she couldn't have that contact anymore, when she couldn't go out and she couldn't lecture, publishing online gave her the feeling of being able to continue to contribute. There was a way in which she didn't want to just sort of go into quiet retirement. She had things to say, and it was very dear. She would ask, especially early on, she became aware of the phenomenon of comments on an article.
Right,
and she wanted to know how many comments there were, and it had nothing to do with vanity. It was the fact that this was a gauge of whether people were responding to what she had to say.
Was she hitting some points that people needed to hear,
that's
and it was
right.
causing a reaction one way or the other? You also said that Lily made no pretenses to originality. How so?
Well, it was that kind of special attitude of perhaps the truly brilliant mind that recognizes that one's brilliance isn't just in one's own originality. It's in discovering truth. And I also say in my introduction, she also really gave the lie to the idea that truth is boring, right? That somehow there's this idea, I think, that there's one truth and we all know it, and it's sort of going to kind of force everybody into these straitjackets. And Lily was a wonderful exponent or a wonderful example of how interesting and varied truth is, because it's always being perceived by individual minds, by individual personalities, and she had these wonderful ways of telling stories that would convey her ideas. So I want to underscore this was not a way of suggesting that she didn't have something to say, but that she had a certain kind of, she understood that to say the most original things really that came out of encountering.
Right, in a lot of ways she had an original way of saying it, but what she was saying was something that was traditions of the church, or she was the greatest proponent, obviously, for the philosophy of her husband.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what she focused on. And you also said here, she often spoke movingly about how each of us, as you were talking about, deserves a patent for our errors, but how truth is never mine or yours, but ours.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that was. I remember she would often say that in the company of all sorts of people. I remember being in a room once with a fairly academic and perhaps even a bit of a dry philosopher, and I think he had misty eyes hearing her sort of describe the vocation of the philosopher in that way.
Who's Sister Prudence Allen?
Well, Sister Prudence Allen is a distinguished Catholic theologian, religious, who wrote a big 3-volume work called The Concept of Woman. And it traces that all the way from, I think the initial volume might even begin with ancient thought, but in any case, it picks up with biblical thought and goes all the way through the medieval period, the modern world. So she's a real authority on how the notion of woman has unfolded within Christian thought and history. And she devotes a big chapter or a big entry to Lily, which is very interesting. It's a longer entry than she devotes to Dietrich on this theme. And she says that Lily is an original contributor to the Church's sort of deepened understanding of woman and also of what she calls integral gender complementarity. So she reads Lily alongside people like Edith Stein and John Paul II.
Yeah, she was very big on women. She'd let you know that.
That's right. Well, she would always say to people like you and me, remember, dear one, you're only a man.
That's right, absolutely. And in Two Souls, One Flesh, she says, to be a human being, therefore, implies being both body and soul, also man and woman, persons of different sexes, but equal dignity, and clearly called to complement each other. It's that complementarity that she was so big on, right?
That's right. That's right, exactly. Despite sometimes reminding us of our mere manhood, she was very clear on the idea that humanity is man and woman together.
She says, when there is disharmony between body and soul, many assume that turning to the other sex will bring them peace. It is my firm conviction that if the body and soul are at war, it inevitably follows that any valid relationship with the other sex will be impossible.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, she had she recognized the way in which there could be kind of a temptation to sort of bring to peace the turmoil in the human soul and in our desires, and yet at the same time that, of course, is no real remedy.
She talks about here, I'm talking about this with the weaker sex in the section where she talks about greater confusion. The greater punishment was given to the weaker sex. okay? She has been given the honor of bringing forth life, yet now this privilege was to be had at a high price, agonizing pains in delivering her child. So talking about the fall, basically.
Yeah, 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 yeah. You know, she had a great sense, and she was wonderful at reading scripture. You know, Lily was a great reteller of scriptural insights, as you see there.
Right. In the essay, The Discrimination Complex, she quotes Nietzsche. She says, Nietzsche made the deep remarks that since the French Revolution, women have more power and less influence.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. She thought that women had somehow forfeited perhaps their true power, which lay in influence and in suggestion, and in encouragement and accompaniment, all of those distinctively feminine qualities as Lily understood them, in favor of wanting to have a power, particularly in the way in which men often wield power.
Right. Well, that seems to be the problem. The problem is aping men rather than being true women.
That was certainly Lily's assertion.
So all these things. She says, before the feminist poison had spread like wildfire, Charles Dickens in Bleak House sketched a perfect caricature of a grotesque female, Mrs. Jellyby, who neglected husband and children, being totally absorbed by her mission to improve the conditions of an unknown African tribe. I remember that in Bleak House.
Yeah.
And she was a character. Why did she point that out?
Well, Lily, I think, understood that again, that the greatest, I mean, really at the core of the vocation of woman is the ability to bring life and nurture life, and that's always done in the concrete. You know, she loved to tell, sort of, her quips would be things like, you know, if you had maybe it's a bit stereotypical, but she would say, you know, if there was a computer and a baby in the womb, she said, I could predict where the man would go and where the woman would go. Men tend more towards abstraction, women tend towards the concrete and to the personal.
Right, absolutely. Now, in Mary, Queen of Widows, an article that she apparently wrote for The Wanderer, she said, there are millions of women who share Mary's fate and have tasted, being the Blessed Mother, have tasted the bitterness of losing a person with whom they had a tender bond for precious years of their lives, who had shared sorrows and their joys. Was she talking about her own loss there?
Well, it was rooted in her own loss.
Yeah,
it was
right.
such a deep bond that she had with her husband, and a bond, not in a way, a bond that went beyond only the bond of love in marriage, but they shared so much, right? Intellectually and spiritually and religiously, artistically. She speaks about that. There's an interview in this book where she describes this kind of unique bond that they had. Yeah. So the loss of that. That relationship. She speaks about the Tabor vision that you have in love. You know, in other words, you see the person perhaps with a kind of deep insight into who they really are. So to lose that with someone to whom she was so close was incredibly painful. And she said, you know, all of this, of course, happened before I knew her. But my understanding is that those early years after the loss of her husband in 1977 were particularly painful for her. But as typical of Lily, she found a way to turn her own suffering and her own insight into this book by Grief Refined, which addresses this issue. And then this is what we should say, I guess, to the viewers, that the case that this article makes is that Our Lady is honored under so many different titles, but not as Queen of Widows.
Right, which you mentioned before was in that.
That's right. That's the essay
you were alluding to earlier, right?
That's right. So
you also have on page 44 Mother Angelica's feminine genius. And Mother talks about a woman who loves, fears nothing. Mother Angelica's supernatural qualities were the golden key to her holy darling, separated by an abyss from self-assurance, which is often the downfall of many machos, starting with the beloved St. Peter. and she talks about Mother's life can be summarized with the words, from defeat to victory. And as you kind of mentioned earlier, when I dedicated my memoirs of happy failure to both Father Benedict Rochelle and Mother Angelica, I did not choose flamboyant words of praise. I just used two quotations. Without me, you can do nothing, and I can do all things in him who strengthens me. And that should be on their tombs. And both of those we were lucky enough to personally know, and are great leading lights, and still so much of what they have to say, even today, means so much in your faith walk.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
She also says in the section on Mother Angelica, the most perfect of all creatures is a woman. There we go. The one who gave birth to the Savior, who declared that he was life itself. History will tell us that this humble nun, talking about Mother Angelica, who founded one of the most powerful Catholic media outlets in the world, would have been the first to declare that it was God's work. She goes on to say, Mother Angelica's amazing life clearly tells us that humility and a heart burning with love can conquer the world. Yeah. That also describes her.
Oh, it absolutely describes her. She was very conscious of her weakness, her frailty. She had also, she used to say that her husband misjudged her strength because he was 34 years older than she was. And so he thought, well, you're in your 30s and your 40s, you should be able to keep up with me. But in fact, he had far more vitality and energy than she did into his 70s and early 80s. And so she suffered a lot physically, and so she had a great sense of her frailty, but at the same time she was able to see in that the great opening to God's grace in our lives, and the ability to sort of throw ourselves into God's mercy and seek His strength.
Right. In the essay, The Blessings of Old Age, she says, in our society, whatever is young, healthy, strong, speaking of that, good-looking, efficient is glorified. The inevitable consequence is that in our society, the fear of getting old makes people panicky.
Yeah, that's right.
And you see that in our society with this youth culture and people Botoxing or whatever they need to somehow think as if they're cheating death.
Yeah. No, she says in there that Pope Benedict's rich white hair was definitely beautiful, but there's an attitude that afflicts all of us, that makes it difficult sometimes to see age and wisdom as going together.
Yeah. It says aesthetic surgeons are so much in demand that they can charge whatever they please, even though these operations are not covered by insurance. One's face must lie at all costs. And I follow up on years ago, white hair is called for respect. Now it's considered ugly. She goes on to say that there was a time when age was respected.
Yeah.
And it clearly isn't anymore.
Yeah. One of the ways in which she bore witness to this was that she, of course, had so much wisdom, and yet she was a little old lady, and people would flock to her. And it was interesting to see how people of all ages, young and old, it wasn't just sort of her peers who thought, oh, what a wise old lady. I mean, you could put a young teenager in front of her like myself, and I was captivated. People were captivated by what she had to say and sensed that wisdom.
Well, she had a spark about her, and a twinkle in her eye when she would say things and do things. And in The Blessings of Old Age, said true elderly persons cannot be baseball champions and they cannot win the marathon, but does this fact deprive them of the wisdom that is usually acquired through experience and suffering?
Right. And she points out that in the case of many figures, their finest work came at the end of their life. She points out that Augustine, his best works are his later works, his weakest are his earlier. So yeah, she used to also quip to the point about the sparkle in her eye when you would say, happy birthday, you're now 95, 96, dear one, every year brings me closer to eternal youth, was one of her comments. And she had a kind of eternal youth about her.
Yeah, well, she was very witty. In Truth or Charity, one of the most burning topics today is the relationship between truth and charity. What's the deal there? What is she talking about?
Well, the false alternative between what is seen to be kind and loving and charitable, and truth as a form of uncaring and coldness.
Right.
And so she wants to bring them back
as
together.
if those are either or when
Exactly.
they go together.
Yeah.
And the charity comes out of the truth.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And that's why she goes after Auguste Comte. Everything is relative except the statement itself. She calls him a megalomaniac. Isn't he like the father of sociology or something, virtually?
Lily did sometimes have fairly dim views even of famous figures.
Right. Well, sociology, to some people, believe was designed to be a secular religion, ultimately, in understanding things. She says the question is not, is it a convincing argument today, but rather, is one willing to be convinced by its validity? I thought that was good, because that's the whole idea. If you're not open to considering the fact that you may be wrong and you need to change, there's no point in having that conversation. Right?
Yeah, and Lily had a lot of charity in her truth. Lots of people, I think, on the one hand, she could be fierce, in her argumentation, but she had a great human sense, and she could sometimes tell you something that really was meant as a, shall we say, constructive criticism, but in the kindest and most sensitive way.
Yeah, she did it in a very gentle way. In her audience with John Paul II, and I know there's a picture when she met him, and this one was actually written for Crisis Magazine in '05. She said, the thing that struck me most was his presence.
Yeah.
I truly had the impression that the man who carried the whole burden of the church on his shoulders was giving me his full attention. Sounds like Mother Teresa, right?
Yeah.
And could have repeated back to me my every word. He was fully there, as if my modest message mattered to him.
Yeah. Well, she was like that as well. One of the things I think so many of us who knew her felt was that, you know, she was such a repository of wisdom and literature and history and philosophy and on, and a great storyteller. But she was, when you were in her presence, you really could be the only person, so to speak. And she was very curious about people, and she would ask you questions about, I mean, you know this, right? She would famously remember your birthday, and you get an email the morning. If you, it was always the first one too, but she was up so early, so at 6 in the morning you'd get an email from her. So this ability to really turn to the other was something that I found striking in someone who was otherwise so vigorous and so intense and so consumed by her ideas and her insights. It was really a wonderful.
Well, in this section we have personal remembrances. There's some Rhonda Chervin, some great people. Cardinal Burke is in there. It's like a who's who of wonderful people. Some well-known, some Peter Kraft is in there. He made the point that Lily, like her husband, was gentle but formidable lion like Aslan. He likes Aslan.
He does.
He always talks about Aslan a lot, but he kind of talked about her like Aslan. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, she always, you know, the book she wrote on her husband was called The Soul of a Lion.
Right,
but I always said, Lily, you know, you have the soul of a lioness.
Yeah, absolutely. And Anthony Esselin, his commentary, he tells a story that before the talk, Father Czech and I had dinner with a few other priests and with his friend who was a frequent guest, Alice von Hillebrand, Dietrich's widow. When she first arrived, I went up to her and said, "Professor, I'm honored to meet you." She shook my hand and said, with a twinkle in her eye, "And who are you?"
Oh, she was lovely.
She'd do that. Now, you also have in here the homily for the funeral mass of Alice von Hillebrand from January 22nd of 2022 by our great friend Father Gerald Murray out of New York, who's terrific, and he's part of, shows up on Ray's show on a regular basis. He said, one of the most central themes in the lives of Dietrich and Alice von Hildebrand was the crucial importance of reverence if man is to order his life properly and fruitfully in this world.
Yes, that was one of the great themes of both Lily and her husband. And she really practiced it. I've been thinking a lot about Lily and reverence. You know, to be in her presence was to experience what reverence looks like in a reverent person. Because again, she could really spar with you, and there was a certain sense in which you felt a little bit at her mercy. But when it came to great questions and great realities, the reality of God and the supernatural, the Mass, there was this ability to sort of place herself before these things with a kind of an awe about her. And I often experienced what it was like to see the world through her eyes, and to see, and it was one of her most, perhaps one of her great gifts to me and to others who knew her, was to not only sort of know what reverence is, or to know what reverence statements are, but to know what reverence looks like in a reverent person.
Right, which is why there was a lot of concern by them in some of the changes in how that was being handled out or acted out, which he called the sin, which he referred to as the sin of being blasé.
Yes.
And this is Gerald Murray again saying, the curse of modern man is that so many of them have lost their sins for wonder and gratitude. Boredom is a punishment for irreverence.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, she had a keen sense for things like this, and I think most of us probably wouldn't think of being blasé as a sin, right? But she understood the way in which boredom grew out of other dispositions that were irreverent and ungrateful. Gratitude, of course, was another one of her great themes in life. Right? A day without gratitude is a kind of missed opportunity of.
Right. Well, gratitude is the key to humility too.
Right. And the key to happiness, she would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in the beginning, the first thing you have in the book is, quote, "Friendship is the remnant of paradise," Alice von Hillebrand, which is obviously the title of these selected essays. What does she mean?
Yeah. Well, you know, we were searching for a title, and, you know, we had somewhat more generic things like the wit and wisdom of Lily, and I thought, well, that sounds a little bit like Chesterton with a cigar or something.
Right,
and then I remembered, first of all, this phrase has been baked into me through years of being with her. She would often say it, and in fact, she and her husband saw lots of remnants of paradise in the world. And there's an essay in there called "The Canons of Friendship," and the very first line is, "Friendship is a remnant of paradise. And it seemed to me that not only was this a great theme in her work, but it expressed the way in which she related to so many of her friends. I think she dignified our friendships by the way in which she honored them, and she saw so much more in them, the possibility. I say in my introduction to the book that I had the feeling sometimes that she cared more about our joys and our sorrows than we ourselves did. Yeah. And she carried them in her heart. And so not only did she say something very beautiful when she said friendship is the remnant of paradise, but she really embodied it in her friendships with us.
Right, there's a beautiful picture of her, and that's on the set of the original Bookmark show when we did that way back when. And so I just wanted to mention that because it brings back great memories, of course. So how long did it take you to actually put this book together when you decided to put it together?
Well, it was the project over many years, but not because it was a constant project, but because it was the kind of thing you needed to come back to. I think the hardest thing was the selection process. How do you winnow down? And even now I think to myself, oh, I should have added that essay, and we already think of volume 2.
Well, I was going to say there's got to be more material coming out.
There's more where this came from, Doug.
Right, okay, great. As well as videos, audios. What's your website that people
Right, so hilderbrandproject.org is the Hildebrand Project's main website. We also have Alice von Hillebrand.org, which is dedicated to her work. Many of the essays, including those not in this book, can be found there. We are also very happy that in the course of this year we will be releasing a whole new Alice von Hillebrand podcast.
Oh, great!
And much of it will feature her series and appearances on Ewtn.
Right, which we were happy to make available.
Oh, we're very grateful to the network for that, and very much looking forward to rolling that out. And then people can also not only read her sparkling prose, but also hear her voice.
Absolutely. Well, she left a good legacy with somebody looking after her legacy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doug.
Okay, we're talking with John Henry Crosby, editor and presenter of the Alice von Hillebrand Remnant of Paradise, selected essays with remembrances by her dear friends by the Hilderbrand Project, which John Henry Crosby leads up. And of course, I'm Doug Keck. We invite you to get this book through our religious catalog, EWTNRC.com, all things Catholic. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, right here on Bookmark.